When it drops to -50 and the wind turns the steppe into something that can freeze your lungs mid-breath, the felt gers stops working. That circular tent everyone pictures when they think of Mongols, it can't handle this. So families did something that doesn't fit the nomadic image at all. They stopped moving and went underground, not fleeing, not hiding in defeat. They dropped into chambers they'd carved under the frozen ground, spaces built to be invisible, and they were so well hidden that historians missed them for centuries. These weren't desperate holes scraped into dirt. They were actual systems, ventilation shafts that looked like snowdrifts, storage rooms that kept food frozen without any effort, tunnels linking living spaces to shelters for livestock. And all of it stayed warm enough to survive in without burning through fuel they couldn't afford to waste. The Mongols figured out something that took modern geothermal engineers a while to learn. The coldest point isn't at ground level. It's about 30 centimeters down. Go deeper than that and the temperature stabilizes. You enter a completely different climate under your feet. The felt gers stops working around -30 degrees Celsius. Not speculation, physics. A standard gers uses 6 to 8 layers of compressed wool felt over a collapsible wooden lattice frame. Keep it heated with dung fires, maintain it properly, and it handles the temperature range most people picture when they think of Mongolian winter. But the steppe doesn't stop at -30. Deep in January and February, across the high plateaus and northern valleys, temperatures hit -40, -50, sometimes lower. 3 problems pile up at once, and no amount of extra felt will fix them. First, you run out of fuel. Mongol herding families burned argol, dried animal dung, as their main heat source, often their only one. Trees basically don't exist across Mongolia's grasslands. Wood wasn't available. Dung was collected through the warmer months and stockpiled in huge amounts, measured by the cartload. Families judged their winter survival by how many loads they'd gathered before the first real snow. But once temperatures drop below -40, the math stops working. The fire has to burn constantly, eating through fuel faster and faster. But the cold is so aggressive that even a roaring hearth can't keep the inside warm. Meanwhile, gathering more fuel becomes impossible. Snow buries the pastures, and the dung freezes into the ground. Second, wind gets through the felt. The Mongolian steppe has almost no natural windbreaks. When blizzards arrive, what the Mongols called har hamulaksh, closing in darkness, the wind doesn't gust and die down. It screams at high speed for days without stopping. At -50 degrees, wind doesn't just chill you, it penetrates. It finds every gap in the felt seams, every flaw in the door covering, every ventilation opening you need to avoid suffocating. The gers becomes a choice between 2 ways to die. Seal it completely and die from carbon monoxide, or allow ventilation and watch the inside temperature drop toward whatever's happening outside. Third, being visible makes you a target. A gers on the open steppe can be seen for kilometers in every direction. Winter was raiding season, when rival groups attacked settled camps because mobility was limited. Chronicles from earlier periods mention families who practiced winter vanishing as a defensive move during clan conflicts. A felt structure announces where you are. It says you're stationary, exposed, possibly weakened by cold. So going underground wasn't about comfort. It was a calculated decision. The moment came when fuel reserves couldn't last another week of surface heating, when the wind made even brief exposure deadly, when staying visible meant staying at risk. At that point, Mongol families did something that goes against every assumption about nomadic life. They went down into the earth and disappeared. The earth 2 meters down stays around 0 Celsius even when the air above hits -50. That 50-degree gap made underground survival work. The Mongols didn't need to know the physics behind it. They just had to notice what happened when you dug past the frost line. You reached a zone that stayed stable no matter what was happening on the surface. The frost line, how deep the ground actually freezes in winter, runs about 1.5 meters in southern Mongolia, closer to 2.5 in the far north. Below that, the ground never fully freezes. It hovers just above or below the freezing point of water. That's not warm. 0 Celsius will kill you if you're wet and sitting still. But it's 50 degrees warmer than the surface, and that difference is survival. 2 meters of packed soil insulates 10 to 15 times better than felt of the same thickness. A GR with 8 layers of compressed wool can't match what Earth does without effort. Then there's thermal mass. Soil heats up slowly, cools down slowly, and smooths out temperature swings. The ground below the frost line absorbs warmth during summer. In winter, it releases that stored energy at a crawl. The result feels cold by any modern standard, but it's cold you can live in with the right clothes and a small fire. The Mongols figured this out without thermometers. The knowledge came through. The earth remembers summer when the wind forgets. Animals showed them the principle. Marmots and ground squirrels spent months hibernating in burrows that would be death chambers if they matched surface temperatures. Root cellars and storage pits confirmed it. In summer, they kept meat from spoiling. In winter, what you stored there didn't freeze solid the moment you put it down. The real efficiency shows up when you add even a little heat to that stable baseline. A small fire, much smaller than what you'd need on the surface, plus body heat from a family and maybe livestock in the next chamber over, could bring interior temperatures up to 5 or 10 Celsius. Still cold. Your breath still fogs. Water left out will freeze overnight. But it's steady cold, not the chaos of wind tearing through felt. You can dress for it. You can sleep in it without constant fear that the fire dies and the space drops to lethal within hours. Permafrost acted as a thermal floor, stopping heat from bleeding down into the deeper earth. Snow piled on top added more insulation. A meter of fresh snow could bury the underground chambers beneath a blanket that separated interior space from whatever was happening on the surface. What they built wasn't warm, it was stable. Surface temperature could swing 20 degrees in a day depending on sun and wind. Underground, temperature barely shifted. That stability made planning possible. You knew your fuel supply. You knew how long it would last. You knew the space would stay within a range that clothing and bedding could handle. The wind couldn't get in. The temperature wouldn't suddenly crash. The earth became a furnace that barely needed feeding, running on principles the Mongols learned through generations of watching and testing. Knowledge that modern archaeology is only starting to piece back together. Construction began in late summer or early autumn, before the ground froze solid. Families looked for sites with specific features: slight elevation so water would drain, southern or southeastern facing slopes that avoided the worst northern winds, closeness to winter pasture where livestock would stay. The excavation was one of the hardest jobs in the annual cycle and required the whole family. Digging through soil that would soon become permafrost meant racing the calendar. A standard sunken floor gers pit measured 4 to 6 meters across and went down 1 to 2 meters. A size that balanced living space against the work of digging and the risk of collapse. In areas where the ground had already started to freeze, families used fire thawing. Build a fire on the spot. Let it burn until the top layer of earth softened. Dig out the thawed soil. Repeat. A single pit could take days. The circular shape matched traditional gers dimensions on purpose. Once the pit reached the right depth, families erected the same collapsible lattice walls they'd use for a surface dwelling. The khana sections that folded and expanded, the roof poles that radiated from a central ring. But the framework sat at the bottom of the pit instead of ground level. Earth was bermed around the base, sometimes reinforced with stones where available, or compacted with clay and sod in grassland areas. The floor stayed earthen in most cases, though some families laid flat stones if a stream bed or rocky outcrop was nearby. Others placed felt mats directly on packed dirt. The central hearth went at the lowest point of the floor, a deliberate choice that used gravity for heat circulation. Warm air rises, creating movement throughout the chamber. The entrance was the hardest part to engineer. Cutting steps straight down into the pit would create a channel for cold air to pour into the living space. Mongols built descending tunnels or notched staircases with a cold trap instead, a design that works because cold air is denser than warm air and settles in the lowest available space. The entrance passage descended below the level of the living floor, then rose slightly into the main chamber. Cold air entering from the surface sank into this depression and stayed there. Warmer air in the living space remained above it. These entrance tunnels were covered with wooden planks where timber was available, or woven willow mats and felt in treeless regions. Some designs used an L-shaped configuration that blocked wind from blowing directly into the living space no matter the direction. The entrance faced away from prevailing northern winds almost always. Southern or southeastern orientations that caught some solar warmth during the brief hours of winter daylight. Regional variations reflected available materials and local climate extremes. In the Altai Mountains, where the Mongol sphere overlapped with Turkic groups and where stone was abundant, families built more substantial walls lined with fitted stones. These were semi-permanent structures used across multiple winters. On the open steppe, where stone was absent and the tradition emphasized mobility even in winter, pits were simpler and more temporary. Families often filled them in completely when moving to spring pastures. Along the forest-steppe boundary where grasslands met Siberian taiga, some groups used timber reinforcement, roof beams that distributed weight better than felt and lattice alone could manage. But this was rare. Most Mongol underground shelters used the earth itself for structural support, relying on the principle that a shallow dome or curved roof transfers weight outward and downward rather than concentrating it at a central point. Water drainage required careful site selection and perimeter trenching. Pits dug on slopes naturally channeled meltwater and seepage away from the living floor. Families excavated shallow trenches around the perimeter at a level below the interior floor. These channels directed water away before it could pool inside the chamber. The drainage system had to work even when the surrounding ground was frozen. Water from body heat, cooking, and melting snow tracked in from outside had to go somewhere, or the space would become uninhabitable. The roof structure balanced insulation against collapse risk. Too much earth piled above, and the wooden lattice and felt covering would fail. Too little, and the thermal barrier wouldn't work. The solution was a shallow profile. The roof rose only slightly above ground level, just enough to allow the central smoke hole and to shed snow rather than accumulate dangerous loads. Every element solved a problem that surface dwelling couldn't address. The earth walls stopped the wind completely. The depth placed the living space below the zone where temperature swung wildly. The entrance design prevented cold air from pouring in. The drainage system kept the floor from turning into mud. The low profile made the structure nearly invisible from even short distances. These weren't shelters stumbled upon by luck. They were engineered solutions that required understanding soil mechanics, heat behavior, and structural principles. Understanding that had no written manual, but lived in construction practice and passed through demonstration and participation across generations. Extended family groups, wintering in the same region, sometimes built clusters of connected chambers. These weren't continuous tunnel networks, more like individual pits placed 3 to 10 meters apart, linked by covered trenches or protected surface paths that let people move between spaces without getting fully exposed to blizzards. The spacing mattered, close enough to be practical, far enough that if one chamber collapsed, it wouldn't take the others with it. The most important connection wasn't between the human living quarters. It was between human spaces and livestock shelters. Sheep and goats could handle semi-underground conditions that horses mostly couldn't. Families carved horizontal chambers into hillsides where the terrain worked, creating barn spaces that opened at ground level but extended back into the slope, earth above acting as insulation. These animal shelters sometimes shared walls with human chambers, allowing heat to transfer through the earth barrier without requiring everyone to live in the same room. A sheep puts out about 100 watts of body heat constantly. That's small on its own, but 20 sheep in an adjacent space added real passive heating. Storage chambers used a strange property of the underground environment. Below the frost line, temperatures stayed consistently at or just below freezing, creating a natural deep freeze that didn't need maintenance. Families dug separate pits for food preservation, carving chambers into permafrost that would keep things frozen more reliably than anything on the surface. Meat from autumn slaughter went into these chambers, wrapped in felt or leather, and stayed frozen but accessible all winter. Dairy products, frozen milk curds, dried fermented arag, were stored the same way. In regions where Mongols had started growing limited grain, dried grains went into separate sealed chambers where the consistent cold prevented spoilage without the moisture problems surface storage faced. The ventilation system was probably the most sophisticated part of the underground engineering because it solved an invisible problem. Carbon monoxide from dung fires has no smell, no color, and it'll kill you in an enclosed space. The Mongols understood this from experience. Oral histories mention winter deaths from bad air, warnings that captured the danger without needing modern chemistry to explain it. The solution was narrow vertical shafts, usually 10 to 15 centimeters across, running from the chamber ceiling to the surface. These were positioned directly above the hearth when possible, using the fact that warm air rises. Stale air heated by the fire would climb through the shaft and exit at the surface while fresh cold air got pulled in through the entrance passage to replace it. The rate of exchange was slow but constant, enough to prevent suffocation and carbon monoxide buildup without stripping away all the heat. The tops of these shafts needed careful design to keep snow out while allowing airflow. Stone arrangements, bone structures, or woven caps let gas through while blocking direct precipitation. In deep snow, these ventilation points got marked with poles or stacked stones that did two things. They kept the shafts from getting completely buried, and they marked where the underground chamber was for family members trying to find the entrance during whiteouts. The knowledge of proper shaft size and placement wasn't written down. It lived in construction practice described in relative terms. 3 fingers width, positioned 1 arm's length from the center, extended to knee height above the surface. These measurements varied by family and region, but represented what people had learned about the minimum ventilation needed to stay alive. Build the shaft too narrow or put it in the wrong spot, and the chamber became a death trap. Build it too wide, and you lost so much heat the space couldn't be lived in. This whole network, human chambers connected to animal shelters connected to frozen storage, all breathing through stone-capped chimneys invisible under snow, worked as one integrated system. From the surface in deep winter, you'd see nothing. Maybe stone markers, maybe a slight irregularity in the snow drifts, maybe nothing at all. But underneath, an entire geometry of survival ran on principles that needed almost no fuel beyond a small fire. no visibility that would attract raiders, and no exposure to the wind that made living on the surface impossible when temperatures hit their absolute worst. Descending underground carried spiritual weight that practical necessity couldn't entirely erase. Mongol shamanic cosmology divided existence into sky, earth surface, and underworld, the realm of ancestors and death. So when winter got lethal enough to force families down, they performed rituals documented in later ethnographic accounts: offerings to earth spirits before excavation, consecration of chambers before occupation. Whether these practices made the spaces acceptable shelter or just acknowledged the transgression of entering death's domain, scholars studying fragmented shamanic sources still debate. Soviet collectivization between the 1920s and 1950s abruptly ended the tradition by forcing nomadic populations into permanent villages with brick construction and coal fuel. These underground structures were designed as temporary, seasonal, and deliberately invisible, so they nearly vanished from archaeological record entirely. Recent surveys in Mongolia's Arkhangai and Kovsgol provinces identified depression patterns and hearth remnants, proving the systems existed, but documentation came almost too late. By the 1970s, few living practitioners remained to explain construction details that had never been written down. The Mongols, who survived the worst winters in human history, did so by becoming part of the earth itself. Using geothermal principles, modern sustainable architects are only now rediscovering. When the industrial world arrived with its visible permanent buildings, it looked directly at the snow-covered depressions and saw nothing, almost erasing the story of people who learned to vanish beneath the steppe and wait out the killing cold in chambers warmed by the ground's memory of summer.